some understandings of the mind, or of the enlightened mind, have it that consciousness can arise alone. That is to say that there can be a kind of a pure consciousness, which perhaps is found in the state of enlightenment or expresses the enlightened mind. The question is this possible in early Buddhism? We find such a goal of pure consciousness in some of the Brahminic texts, such as the early Upanishads. We find it in Western theorizing, such as the Gnostics. We find it even in some forms of later Buddhism. This idea that perhaps consciousness even is a kind of a ground of being that underlies all things. That consciousness is a kind of an unchanging form of being. That the changeable aspects of the world, the changeable aspects of the mind are all problematic and can be dispensed with over time, and what we're left with is this kind of consciousness that arises alone. The goal then of practice would become that of unchaining this body and mind from this underlying consciousness, and to allow that consciousness to unify, perhaps non-dualistically, with a state of being, perhaps Brahman, as it's known in the Brahminic texts and in the early Upanishads, perhaps again in some other form, but that's the general picture of a kind of a consciousness, again, that arises alone, a pure consciousness. While such ideas were reflected in some aspects of later Buddhist Dharma, they were rejected by the Buddha on many grounds. And in today's video I want to discuss how, in early Buddhism, consciousness does not arise alone. To begin with, there's no single thing, consciousness, in early Buddhism. Rather, there are 6 different types of consciousness, one for each sense modality. So we have eye consciousness, ear consciousness, and so on. All of them depending upon a sense organ, such as the eye or the ear, and a sense base, such as visual forms, sounds, and so on. The consciousness, therefore, doesn't arise independently, but rather arises dependent upon the eye and forms, or the ear and sounds, and so on. Another route to understanding the dependent nature of consciousness in early Buddhism involves the formula of dependent origination itself. The formula of dependent origination is quite complex, and I can't get into all of it here. And in particular, there are 2 different forms. There are several different forms, but there are at least 2 different forms of this formula found in early Buddhism, both of them giving slightly different roles for consciousness. In one of them, the Mahanidana Sutta, consciousness has an interplaying role with another aspect known as name and form. Now again, this is quite complex, and there are lots of disagreements and controversies over what name and form really means. However, perhaps we can understand it this way. Consciousness is dependent upon name and form because without the body and other mental aggregates or mental aspects, consciousness would not arise. On the other hand, name and form depends on consciousness because without consciousness, name and form would pass away. Essentially, the body would die if it were not conscious. There's also a different form of the formula of dependent origination, the more famous 12-link version. In that version, consciousness arises dependent upon volition. This is rather strange. Now we might ask, how is it that consciousness arises dependent upon volition? Now, the Buddha actually gives an answer to this question in one early sutta. This is what the Buddha says. And here we have to understand that intentions and plans are other words for volitions. Mendicants, what you intend or plan and what you have underlying tendencies for become a support for the continuation of consciousness. When this support exists, consciousness becomes established. When consciousness is established and grows, there is rebirth into a new state of existence in the future. When there is rebirth into a new state of existence in the future, future rebirth, old age, and death come to be, as do sorrow, lamentation, pain, sadness, and distress. That is how this entire mass of suffering originates. If you don't intend or plan, but still have underlying tendencies, this also becomes a support for the continuation of consciousness. So our volition, our will, our intentions and plans are what preserve our consciousness, are what keep our consciousness going. And the Buddha adds that even in the absence of such volition, such desires, such willpower, and so on, if we have these underlying tendencies that continue, the underlying tendencies towards, let's say, greed or aversion or ignorance, these, even in the absence of volitions, can support the continuation of consciousness. The Buddha goes on to add, if you don't intend or plan or have underlying tendencies, this doesn't become a support for the continuation of consciousness. With no support, consciousness is not established. So, in the absence of such willpower, such volitions, and such underlying tendencies, consciousness ceases to be. Another way to understand this dependency of consciousness, this interdependency, involves looking at consciousness in comparison or along with the other aggregates, the other mental and physical aggregates, the other parts of the body and the mind. Here the Buddha says this: as long as consciousness remains, it would remain involved with form, supported by form, founded on form, that is, the bodily form. And with a sprinkle of relishing, it would grow, increase, and mature. Or consciousness would remain involved with feeling. Or consciousness would remain involved with perception. Or as long as consciousness remains, it will remain involved with volition. Mendicants, suppose you say, apart from form, feeling, perception, and volition, I will describe the coming and going of consciousness, its passing away and reappearing, its growth, increase, and maturity. That is not possible. So consciousness only arises in dependence upon these other aggregates, these other mental and physical states. In the absence of such states, consciousness cannot be said to arise. Indeed, following the general formula of dependent origination, consciousness arises through ignorance and craving. If we give up craving, if we overcome craving, if we overcome ignorance, then the process that leads to the arising of consciousness will cease. Again, as the Buddha says in one early sutta, if a mendicant has given up greed for the feeling element, perception element, volitions element, consciousness element, the support is cut off, and there is no foundation for consciousness. That is, consciousness arises through causes and conditions following, again, this formula of dependent origination, this chain of dependent origination. And when this chain is broken by the overcoming of ignorance or the ending of craving, then the whole chain unravels and consciousness comes to an end. Elsewhere, the Buddha discusses this same topic in the context of ordinary people who don't understand the way things really work. He says, they don't truly understand form, which is not self, as not self. They don't truly understand feeling, perception, volitions, consciousness, which is not self, as not self. They don't truly understand form, which is conditioned, as conditioned. They don't truly understand feeling, perception, volitions, consciousness, which is conditioned, as conditioned. They don't truly understand that form will disappear. They don't truly understand that feeling, perception, volitions, consciousness will disappear. The idea in this passage being that the enlightened person's aggregates at death will disappear. Their mental aggregates will go to nothing just the same as their physical aggregates will decay eventually into nothing. At the end of these passages, the Buddha goes on to say, since that consciousness does not become established and does not grow, with no power to regenerate, it is freed. Being free, it's stable. Being stable, it's content. Being content, they're not anxious. Not being anxious, they personally become extinguished. Now, this metaphor of consciousness being freed is perhaps to an extent misleading to some. That is, it suggests that consciousness, again, is alone out somewhere on its own, sort of flying around, if you like, sort of doing its own thing. However, the other passages that I've just cited strongly counter such an interpretation. The commentary to this passage is likely accurate. That is to say, the commentary says that consciousness is freed simply means that it is no longer attached to the world of samsara, and as such is no longer going to be reborn into a future life. As such, this consciousness that's freed from attachment to samsara, attachment to karmic action, attachment to rebirth, is, as it says, content, stable, not anxious. And that happens within this lifetime for the person who is enlightened, and then upon their passing away, that consciousness will become extinguished. The upshot is that consciousness does not arise alone in early Buddhism. Consciousness always arises dependent upon other things, dependent upon our other aggregates, dependent upon our plans, our volitions, dependent upon our underlying tendencies. When these cease or are uprooted, consciousness itself will eventually cease. And the final state, the state which is the goal of early Buddhist practice, is not a state in which consciousness itself arises. I did an earlier video on a discussion, a disagreement that the Buddha had with one of his monastics who had made a mistake about this very topic, about the topic of consciousness. And I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or would like to see it again. Thanks so much for watching. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel. Thanks, and we'll catch you on the next one, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.